Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of Stable Diffusion for professional creatives. Today's video is going to be slightly different than usual. Instead of taking a look at a workflow, we'll be taking a look at how to build workflows, like in general. I've been doing this job for a while now, and I've worked with a number of different clients on different projects. And since I have received a ton of questions about whether or not there's actual jobs in the generative AI space, doing basically what I do in my own videos, I thought, well, why not talk about the actual workflow design process from a commercial perspective? But well, what it is that I do now, what it's my job. I have been a fashion photographer for 10 years, and since 4 years ago I started working with generative AI. At that point it was mostly gowns. We didn't have DALL-E, we didn't have Midjourney, it was just very nerdy stuff. And throughout these 4 years I've been working more and more in this field. Now, since a couple of months ago I stopped being a fashion photographer and I assumed a new position as head of creative AI. And most of my days are spent creating new workflows and pipelines in the generative AI space. During my now years of doing this job, I ended up developing a quite simple sort of mental flowchart when I'm getting a new request from a possible client. And I try to stick to this flowchart through development. So as we can see here, the usual process starts with a request, after which I decompose the pipeline, the problem, the possible issues, and the various parts of the workflows and pipelines. And it all ends with a recompose phase where all these tiny bits are mashed all together in one giant pipeline. Throughout this process, I might be on my own, I might have a support team, there might be other people involved, but at its core, request, decompose, and recompose is always what happens. But before talking about all these big blocks, let's talk about design philosophy. When a client asks me or asks you to create workflows and pipelines, most of the time they are starting from an idea. The idea can be rough or polished, but most of the time it's the most important thing they have and they care for. However, I or you implement your tools and your stack in order to get this idea to life, well, that's your own issue. And well, that's very similar to a concept in design, which is top-down design. In the top-down design philosophy, the important thing is that everything you do is for that core idea and reflects that core idea. So in our case, from a specific request, you need to find a solution based on the tools you have available. But again, what's important is the idea. It's not whichever tool you end up using or how you end up using them. The opposite of this design philosophy is bottom-up design. Whereas top-down design starts from an idea, bottom-up design starts from the tools you have. Bottom-up design is the design space for research and development, for example, where the idea is vague and you might not end up reaching that specific idea you had and you started building from. And it's where the tools you have are the most important things. An example of top-down design would be a client reaching out to you for creating workflows that are capable of producing backgrounds for already existing product, where the request is very simple, but it's also the key to the product they want to develop and sell. And there's various ways in which you can achieve this, but the client doesn't really care. They only want to generate new backgrounds for products. And on the other hand, an example of bottom-up design would be, I see light just came out, what are the limitations of it, what can we do with it, can we do something with product photography, for example. And then you end up developing product relighting, you end up implementing frequency separation, etc., etc. All of these are examples that happen to me. Now, when it comes to requests from new or returning clients, this is the sort of quote-unquote checklist that I go through every time I have to embark on a new project, or every time I have to decide whether or not I want to embark on a new project. The first thing that I have to do every single time is evaluate if a request is precise or if it's confused. An example of a precise request, again, would be I want to generate new backgrounds for products. Or it could also be something a bit more in general terms, like in my studio pipeline, I have these pictures of clothes. Can I use them in order to generate on-model pictures? So that's virtual try-on. A confused request would be something like I want to use AI to generate product photography, or in the case of virtual try-on, it would be something more like I don't want to shoot anymore, I just want to generate everything with AI. In the first cases, you can ascertain that the client knows at least a bit of what they're talking about, whereas in the second cases, you already know that the client doesn't really know what they're talking about, and that might be an issue down the line. Now, in both cases, clients may want something done a certain way. It can be because of actual legitimate reasons, or it can be just because they heard about something or they think that something is right, whereas it really isn't the case. Now, in either of these cases, I try to evaluate if what they ask for to be done in a certain way is the best way to do it. And if it isn't, I try to ask whether or not they would like things to be done differently. And the reason why I try to do this, and this is going to be a common theme throughout the whole process, is that I try to communicate and limit the possible points of failure by being certain that the boundaries are well established at all points in development. But regardless of whether or not a limitation has been established by the client for a legitimate reason or otherwise, at the end of the day, it's their choice, and if they want to do things a certain way, then it's just my choice whether or not I want to embark on a project that has those kinds of limitations. If I see these limitations as something that's gonna end up causing trouble down the road, then I will usually say so and most probably not embark on that project. Or if the client assures me that they have reasons for that, and if we end up finding that trouble that I had foreseen, it won't be an issue because they will allocate more resources in order to solve that trouble, then I will most probably decide to embark on that project. And this brings us to the next step, which is evaluate possible high-level issues. This is the step where I usually explain the current hardware and software limitations that I already found on other clients and other projects, as well as limitations in terms of models that we currently have available, etc., etc. We are not going into detail with the client about what these limitations are in particular. We just want to give them a rough idea of what are the potential troubles that we might find ourselves in if we decide to go on with this project. But since clients usually don't really like hearing only about potential issues, I do take my time to try and outline possible solutions to these issues that I've already laid out. So in our relighting example, if the client wants to go for non-optimal resolutions and higher resolutions, a possible issue would be that IC Light is a 1.5 model and the optimal resolution is 512 by 512, but a potential solution would be that I've found a way to work with multipliers in the IC Light pipeline so that it's not bound to the optimal resolutions anymore. There is a ceiling, of course, in the resolutions that you can handle, but at least there's a solution up until a certain point. Now, finding out about issues and possible solutions requires a ton of knowledge. So you have to be wary of your actual level of knowledge. And if you are aware of the fact that you do not possess the necessary skill set or deep enough knowledge, you don't want to overpromise and underdeliver. So if I were you and you were just starting out, I would try to underpromise and overdeliver instead. And I would just always talk in terms of possibilities rather than certainties. In our IC Light example, if you didn't know, for example, about the multiplier solution to non-optimal resolutions, I would say something like, IC Light has an optimal resolution of 512 by 512, but I will see if there's a solution to that. I will see if there's a way to increase the maximum optimal resolution. You're not saying that you can absolutely do that, but you will try your best to find a solution. The next step in evaluating a request is in the realm of time and money, which is roughly the same thing. First of all, I want to evaluate how long a project will take. And that's for two reasons. For starters, I want to know if I will be able to see through this project. My time is limited, and I don't have much time to embark on new projects now. So if I find a project that I would like to take on, I want to be sure that I will have enough time to start on it and, most importantly, finish it. This might seem obvious, and well, it is, but if you are a freelancer just starting out, chances are you are going to take on way more jobs than you can actually handle, or at least try to, because you don't have a baseline. You don't even know how many jobs you can take on, or how many jobs are going to come in the future. The second reason why I want to evaluate how much time a project will take is because I can then define a timeline for the client. And I always try to err on the side of caution so that the client can know what to expect in terms of timelines and deliverables. And the hardest thing, of course, is to evaluate how much money the project will cost in terms of your salary. Now, I am in the privileged position of being one of the few people who can do what I do in a very young and booming industry, so I do cost a pretty penny. But if I were you, I would try to evaluate my own expertise and try not to sell myself too low. And that's because at the moment, finding new creative solutions with generative AI comes at a premium. And I don't think it will always be like this in the future. But right now, what most of my clients are asking for is for things that do not exist. And so I have to create them from scratch. I was holding a masterclass a few weeks ago, and one of the students asked me, why aren't there easier UIs, easier tools to use? And I thought, well, if there were, there wouldn't be any value in what I do. Because if this stuff was easy, then anyone could do it. In terms of time and money, you also want to evaluate if additional people are needed or required. In the beginning, when I was just starting out, I was a one-man operation. I did basically everything that I could on my own, and I developed workflows that only worked inside of ComfyUI. The front end was the backend, and the backend was the front end. As time went on and the client requests became more and more complex, I decided to stop being a one-man solution. And that's because I'm not a backend engineer, I am not an ML engineer, I am not an automation engineer, I am not a front-end engineer, I'm not a UX designer. What I do is just a very specific thing, and so if I understand that there's more people who should be involved in a project, I specifically say so. So in my case, I only take care of workflows, and usually there's a couple of engineers involved, there's a couple of designers, etc. All depending on the projects I embark on. And that usually makes life easier for everyone. Another good thing to do at this point is to evaluate the licenses that you're going to need. And this has been something that I've been talking about on my channel in the last few months. And I've been concentrating on this mostly because it's a vital part of my job. If a client wants to do something involving a model that is under a non-commercial license, for example, you have two roads ahead of you. You can either try to find a commercially open license for something that is similar enough to what they want to do and use, or you can have them understand that they must obtain a commercial license. Now, how do you know about commercial licenses? Well, there's no easy way really. You just go through all of the GitHub repos that you'll end up using, look for the licenses, and then communicate with the client about them. Another thing that I like to do at this stage is evaluate the limitations of your stack. For example, I do have a lot of experience with ComfyUI. I know the ins and outs of Comfy and its own limitations. And I also have acquired some knowledge about the distributed computing solutions that are available out there. So AWS, SageMaker, Replicate, RunPod, whatever. And at this stage, I like telling clients about the limitations that I've found on other projects. And I tell them to keep this into consideration from the get-go, from the start of a project. Because chances are they're going to face these limitations themselves anyway down the line. Sometimes they're not going to believe you, but well, at least you told them about them. Once you've got everything down for the request and you decided to accept a job, what I like to do is decompose the whole project into tiny bits that I can tackle one at a time. So going back to design philosophy, I design a top-down pipeline that starts from the idea and goes to the tools that I have to use. So for example, in the product background generator workflow, I would say, okay, I need to input an image and generate a new background for that image with the image on top. So I need, for example, to get rid of the background, control the generation in some way, generate a new image, make sure that the new environment and background and the original product are well tied together. Be sure that the details and colors are preserved throughout the generation. I want to make sure that it's in the right color space. I want to make sure that it's at the right resolution, etc., etc. All of these are different minimal elements of the process. And all of this can be solved one after the other. So what I like doing is just tackle one element at a time. So in this case, I will pinpoint blockers. Blockers are elements that, until solved, do not allow me to go on through the process. So in the case of a background generation, I know that background removal is already mostly solved, and since we're working with hard surfaces, I can employ whichever background removal model. I would just need to find a commercially available one, so that's not a blocker. A blocker would be finding the optimal control net depth or control net line art weight for getting good generations all the time. So up until that point, I can develop But at that point, I will need to stop and test things out. After solving that, I would need to check if the new background follows the same lining, for example, as the original picture. If it doesn't, I would need to implement relining. So all of these are blocker elements that I want to solve one by one from the bottom up. I don't try to solve everything at the same time, because that would be madness. Instead, I try to solve one small thing after the other. And that ties in with the concept of giving the client a timeline. This way, the client can follow you through development and knows where to expect blockers, because you have already identified them. And if a new blocker pops up that you didn't foresee, you can always communicate that and say, okay, I'm going to need more time on this because I didn't expect this to happen. Now, there's different kind of blockers. There's blockers that are there just because you don't know how to solve something, and there's blockers that are there just because there's no support for them. Ironically enough, the first case is the easiest. You just have to learn how to do something. And while that might seem obvious, you'd be surprised about how many people do not even Google for a solution. And I would know. I get emails every day about very easy stuff to solve from my videos, where most of the time the solutions are already there. And if they're not in the video, they're most probably in the comments. Now, the other kind of blocker is a harder one to solve. In this group of blockers, you can usually find the lack of nodes. If this happens to me, what I usually do is just Google one or two keywords for what I want to do plus ComfyUI and see if something comes up. And well, it usually does. But if I cannot find anything, neither in the manager or on the web, what I usually try doing is setting up a system of unrelated nodes, each of them doing a separate thing, but that together can do exactly what I'm looking for. So imagine the need for finding out a common blur value for a mask that you don't know how big or small it's going to be depending on the product that the client inputs. Well, you could try looking for a node that does automatic blurring depending on the relative size of an object in an image, but that's a very specific node. I don't think that exists. What you could instead do is use some math nodes in order to calculate the relative dimension of the object and the image itself, and then derive the blur value depending on that relative size. When I usually set these complex systems up, I leave them as separate nodes, but if I want to be extra fancy about it, I can just create a new node that does exactly that, all inside of one node. That has been the case for frequency separation in the beginning. It's been the case for this blurring percentage based on relative size for another client of mine. A couple days ago, it's been the case for finding out a contour net strength based on the average gray value of a certain region in a depth map. All of these things do not have a node. And honestly, I would be very surprised if they had, because they're very specific things. But not having a node doesn't mean that there's no solution. You just have to build it yourself. And if there is no apparent solution, what I would suggest doing is communicate with the client first. And I like communicating because most of the time you can find solutions outside of your stack. My stack is basically ComfyUI and diffusion models. But since the overall stack is Python and JSONs, there might be an engineer on the team, or there might be the need for a new engineer on the team that can solve your blocker outside of ComfyUI, outside of your stack. Let's say, for example, that you want to integrate a loop, or you have an undefined number of inputs on something. Comfy doesn't handle that really well, but Python does. So maybe handling that blocker outside of ComfyUI is the better solution after all. Now, the last case, if there is absolutely no solution. This usually happens when there is no model for what you want to do, if you cannot train a model for what you want to do, or if the project has no budget for creating something new. Well, in this case, I'm sorry to say that development stops. If it's completely outside of the realm of things that you can do, the development stops at least for a while until a solution comes up, or forever. Then what happens once you've started and finished building the small elements and everything works? Well, first of all, you link up all the decomposed elements that can either be in your stack or outside of your stack, and you test your own pipeline. Now, this is usually my first proper testing, and it's manual. Manual testing takes a ton of time, moreover, if it's a very complex pipeline, so I try to keep this to a minimum. If the test is successful, I deliver this alpha pipeline, otherwise I repeat my steps and try to learn from testing what's going wrong and what's going well. Testing is very important because as you're building things, you are mostly going to work on one case or on a couple of cases, but you want to be sure that what you're building always works. And during testing, you're going to learn a lot of limitations and a lot of possibilities that may happen with different kind of inputs and outputs. After all of this is done, what I like to do is set up automation. Now, once again, I'm not an automation engineer, so what I usually have is engineers setting up automation for my pipelines. This way, you can test your pipeline properly in an automated fashion against a ton of different inputs and situations. Again, if the test is successful, I deliver the pipeline. Otherwise, I repeat the steps where it's going wrong, and I learn from testing what's going well and what's going not so well. All throughout this, I love to document and communicate the existing limitations. Because first of all, it's very useful to me. Because maybe I'm developing 3, 4, 5 different things at the same time. And if I have to shelve a project for a couple days or a couple weeks and then go back to it, at least I know from the documentation where I left it. And also because the client has to know and needs to understand the current limitations. It is basically impossible to design a workflow that works 100% of the time. And the clients need to understand this. You never know what the users may end up using as inputs. No matter how clear you were, you may never know how the clients end up using your workflow, no matter how strict you were in defining the scope of the project. So communication, at least to me, is key here. And after all of this is said and done, it's time to finally deliver. So usually I deliver the pipeline and the documentation as well, so that the clients can work on their own from here on out. Personally, I don't like offering support, at least continued support, mostly because support is undefined. I think it's cheaper for clients to handle support on their end based on the pipeline and the documentation I provide, so I always try to limit that a lot. But your mileage may vary, so if you want to define support in a different way for your own case, you're free to do so. If you want to make more money, for example, by offering continuous support, then be my guest. Another thing that I like doing is asking for feedback. I want to know how it went. I want to know if everything is working on the client's end. And, well, overall, I just want to know whether or not they're happy with how things went. It's just a way for me to grow in what I do. So, all in all, that is how I operate, how I design complex workflows for clients, and how I deal with blocks during the development process. I think that right now we need a ton of people that are well versed in what I do, because there's not a lot of people around here that can do this kind of jobs. And honestly, it's a quite exciting line of work. So if you have any more questions, feel free to ask them down here in the comments. If you like this video, leave a like and subscribe. My name is Andrea Baioni. You can find me on Instagram @ReasonableShoe or on the web at andreabaioni.com. And same as always, I will be seeing you next week.